All right. We are live, I think, right now. Hopefully, you guys didn't see too much of that editing on the fly. And yes, we are live. Okay, just checking. So, this is not the normal thing I had planned, but I have a family with wife and kids and a full time job, so I wasn't able to get the whole episode ready. But I wanted to cover the Andrew Klavan kind of situation that with Candace and the Daily Wire, well, Candace leaving and all that kind of stuff. Because I think outside of the entire inflammatory aspects of the Daily Wire fan base and the quote unquote free speech advocate base, and it's a pretty nasty situation. But the reality is that and by the way, I'm Daniel Roberts. I forgot. It's been a pretty crazy day. Anyway, but the reality is that this, I think, highlights a deeper issue given the question of what does it mean to follow Christ. And full disclosure, I thought Klavan's response was awesome. I think you should go watch it. But I also think that the division amongst Christians in America is causing us to lose our representation in the political space. And I think that this division highlights that. And so I want to talk to you about that tonight with some quick thoughts on the Solomon's Corner podcast. So I'm going to play my intro.
Welcome to the Solomon's Corner podcast, a place for thinkers. Join us as we explore the depths of theology, philosophy, and the Christian intellectual life.
All right, welcome back. So anyway, just full disclosure, I also do all of this stuff at the same time. Now, the guys at the Daily Wire, they got a whole team. They have the whole thing. So this is really a show, like a magic show, because I'm going to have to be pushing buttons over here. I'm going to have to be navigating while I tell you what I think about this stuff. But I also have, kind of that disclaimer that, if my thoughts get a little scattered, it's because I'm trying to, run a spaceship over here. But the main point of tonight's conversation is to say, I think Klavan did a great job. I think you should go watch his response. I think it highlights stuff. I think if you don't agree with Klavan, I think you're missing some issues in your own personal philosophy. And the main thing, just in summary, I think, is that Candace and what's going on at the Daily Wire is more of a HR issue than it is a free speech issue. And the reason why is because of the fact that the same people who say that they want freedom of speech and that they say this is a free speech issue and some sort of big con kind of thing or whatever. And anybody who's followed my tweets, will know that I was kind of critical of the Daily Wire's kind of YouTube stuff at the time. And but I did not agree with how Crowder had done all that stuff. But during that whole thing, I kind of noticed that Candace was like the female version of Crowder. And even in that whole defense, it didn't seem like she was defending the Daily Wire. It seemed like she was defending herself. But in this situation, people are saying, well, it's a free speech issue. Like there are a bunch of hypocrites over there. No, there are a bunch of business owners over there. And one of the things that you want to make sure that you have if you're a business is the right to fire people, which, again, nobody said that she was fired or anything like that. But if somebody in your company is hurting your brand, that brand is something you built. Just like if you own property, you want to be able to control what's happening on the property because that's your private property. Well, your business is your business. And it's successful because of what you created it to be. And so if you have a problem with an employee, you want to make sure that you have the right to do what's necessary to distance yourself from a toxic employee if that's what you perceive it to be, because that's the whole point here. This isn't about objective truth here relative to the business. It's about what the business thinks is best for them. And if Candace goes off and starts her business, she's going to want the same things. So, she's going to want to have the right to be able to say, hey, you're hurting my brand. So, maybe you should go somewhere else and maybe we should just cut ties with this. So I think primarily this is an HR issue, not a freedom of speech issue. I think that, this is pretty apparent by one of the clips that I'm going to play for you because Klavan gets into all the details. He technically says she retweeted a tweet that was pretty anti-Semitic. It was extremely anti-Semitic, and I'm not going to post that here because I'm a small channel and I'll get suppressed. So you can go watch Klavan, who's got a larger platform on that. But this is what he said, just to kind of highlight just some of the problems. And imagine if this is your business and you've got an employee who's going viral saying this kind of stuff, and you're a Christian. You don't even have to have it be the same issue. Just some issue that you feel would be toxic to your brand. Just listen to this.
With all honesty, I don't even know who Rabbi Shmuley is. I have no idea. I didn't look him up. I haven't seen anything from him. She's complaining about him. Fine. You don't like a rabbi? You're allowed not to like. You're allowed not to like Ben. You're allowed not to like anybody you don't like. If you can spell it out for me, what the problem is. But when you start saying things like some of those books Hitler burned weren't so bad, I was shocked. This is something Candace actually said. I was surprised to learn that the books Hitler was burning, or the Nazis were burning, they weren't good books. They were bad books. They were socialist books. So they burn. That's true.
I just want to say I really love Klavan a lot. Like, I don't agree with everything he says, and we're going to get into that in a minute. But man, I really love listening to this guy.
Burning the book is the act of a savage, first of all. And when you start with burning books, you start burning people. But they burned Joseph Conrad, one of my favorite writers, Kafka, Hemingway, Jack London, and yes, some socialists, some of whom were extremely talented and some of whom were extremely interesting, like Karl Marx is an extremely interesting writer with whom I deeply, deeply disagree, but I don't burn his books because I'm not a savage. When you start saying that, that's a dog whistle. I'm sorry. I know it's a leftist phrase. I know they use it, randomly with anything you say. I understand all of that. Still, the depredations of the Nazis against the Jews are one of the most well-documented, recorded atrocities in human history because they're Germans. They're Germans. They keep records. They keep very good records. We know these things happen. They weren't burning books. They also hated Einstein because his science was Jewish science. They hated Mendelssohn, one of their great composers, because his music was Jewish music. That's the way they thought. It's lunacy. It's lunacy to think that way. So when you start to say, well, some of those books they burned are bad books, I'm sorry. That's a dog whistle. With all honesty.
So this is, essentially a small thing that Klavan covers compared to what else he covers about what the issues were. And I'm not going to dive into those because that's not my primary reason for talking about this, because I think that what we'll talk about later highlights more of the issue for Christians in general. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in Christianity and culture and how those things intersect, and ultimately how to think rightly about the times that we're in. And so we're going to use a philosopher, Hannah Arendt, to look at some of the issues around what's going on here, because she wrote in the 1950s. She wrote a book called The Human Condition. But if you look at, let me pull up one of her quotes here. Yeah, so this is a good example of one of the other points that I think on the Candace thing, just before we dive into the Christian stuff, is that I think that she got a little bit, and I think a lot of people do this, I think they allow their channel to, and I'm small, so I'm not going to be necessarily immune to this, but they allow their channel to, their content to be driven by the reaction and they find meaning in the reactions rather than the truth. And I think that's what's probably happened with Candace. I never really enjoyed her content that much. It wasn't really my thing. Thought her vaccine stuff was pretty good. It was just pretty informative. You could play video games and listen to it and come away with some decent content. But if you look at this quote from Hannah Arendt, she talks about the fact of what kind of starts a civilization to start declining. And one of the things she says, and by the way, she was a Jewish philosopher, and she fled the Nazis and survived the Holocaust. And you always have to introduce Hannah Arendt as kind of a person who apparently had a love affair with like Martin Heidegger, who was an existentialist philosopher. And whenever I bring up Hannah Arendt, I always think that it sounds like it should be an HBO miniseries. But besides the point, This is what she says. The point, then, is not that there is a lack of public admiration for poetry and philosophy in the modern world, but that such admiration does not constitute a space in which things are saved from destruction by time. The futility of public admiration, which daily is consumed in ever greater quantities, this is the 1950s, on the contrary, is such that monetary reward, one of the most futile things there is, can become more objective and more real. And she basically is trying to make the point here that as we are consuming more and more and more and more stuff, that and as that consumption of information becomes monetized through newspapers and all these kinds of things, what is the objective goal starts to be obscured by something quote unquote objective, which would be the monetary. And we start chasing the money rather than the truth. Now, her book is pretty hard to understand and it's pretty difficult. In fact, when I first started reading it, I told people don't read it. And then I found myself quoting it so much that I had to ultimately submit to the fact that it was pretty genius. But, it's a hard book. But I think this is what is basically happened with Candace is that, like Andrew Klavan says, she's very talented. She has even me, like she would post something and I would be like, well, what's she saying now? And I'd start listening. She'd hold my attention for at least 5 to 10 minutes. So she's got the charisma. She has all those qualities. And I see you all here. Welcome to the podcast. If this is the first time, hit the like button, subscribe. But the main thing is that I think that this is the danger of the analytics world. And you see this also with like celebrity podcasters, or, the question is, some of them are converting. Are they converting because they see Catholicism trending on Twitter? And so they are suddenly now interested in Christianity? Is it a sincere conversion? Well, God can use anything, but it's a little bit weird when you see all of these influencers suddenly jump on the bandwagon after somebody who doesn't really have an influence, like Shia LaBeouf, become Catholic. And now a lot more people are suddenly saying, hey, I'm thinking about becoming Catholic too. And it's not going to hurt their channel. In fact, it's going to open up a new audience. And so Hannah Arendt is saying essentially here that what I interpret it as is that if we aren't careful with chasing this information, it's not enough to just admire these things. It's that we are building a society in which the admiration never lasts like it did before. And so you see this stuff on Twitter all the time. You'll see Culture Critic, for example, great page to follow, by the way, highly recommend. Always ask the question, why don't we build things like this anymore? Well, Hannah Arendt just answered the question, is that we are more concerned with whether or not we are going to make monetary gains in the present rather than whether or not we're going to preserve the truth for the future. And that's a big problem. And so this ultimately gets back to this question of, okay, well, the inflammatory issues. Like, this is a very contentious issue. And this is not my full-time job, so I'm not going to dive into the thing that could, if this by any happenstance went viral, get me fired. So, I'm not going to talk about that. But I am going to talk about the fact that Candace and Andrew Klavan obviously both have two different views of what it means for Christ to be king. And the thing that's a problem is that those views are not necessarily shared by other groups of people or institutions in their fullness. Doesn't mean that, the Catholic Church or the Baptists or any others will say Christ is king. They'll all say Christ is king. But they obviously understand that in different ways. And if you paid attention to the way that Andrew Klavan dealt with the Christian side of things, and I understand he was doing this on the fly, and I really like Andrew Klavan. No hate, Andrew Klavan, just if you see this, I really enjoy your content. So, just take this as mutual Christian criticism, But the main thing that I think is problematic is that we are losing our identity because we can't agree on what it even means to be Christian, morally speaking. So, for example, Candace has now left the Daily Wire. I checked her YouTube page. Last I checked, she's already got over 1.5 million subscribers that have followed her to her content. And whether you agree with her or not, or whether you disagree with her or not, that's a lot of people. And the Daily Wire has a lot of followers combined. And many of them are Christians. As Andrew Klavan points out at the end, he says, Jeremy Boring can't write this check anymore because you're doing things that as a Christian he can't support. So the nature of this whole situation is, okay, well, what does it mean for Christ to be king, and what are going to be the implications if we can't agree? And what I mean by that is this. So take a look at this clip that Andrew Klavan says about why he doesn't think that Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson need to convert because God has them right where he wants them.
My friend, Ben Shapiro. And I understand this. All of you who love Ben, and I love Ben, and Jordan Peterson, you all want to see them find Jesus because you know what joy and freedom that gives you, and you certainly feel that it alters your relationship with God. But when I think about this, to be honest with you, and I know some people will disagree with this, but life is not a game show where you guess the name of God and you get to go to heaven. Honk, yes, the name is Jesus. I look at Ben's life and I think if Ben were to embrace Jesus Christ, it would cause devastation to his family, to the people who love him, to the people who listen to him, to his position in the world. I just have this feeling that God has put this guy where he wants him to do what he wants him to do. And as you know, I feel that, the Jews are not abandoned by God. I feel the same way about Jordan. Jordan struggles with this stuff, and I feel like I have an inkling of why he has to struggle with it, but his struggle is inspiring to other people. And I think God wants his boys where he's got them, and there's no thought in my mind that he is going to send these guys into battle and then turn his back on them when they come marching home. It's not a game show. Christ is love, Christ is truth, Christ is the logos of the moral order. You follow love, you follow truth, you follow the moral order. You will find yourself ultimately at Jesus Christ's door. I don't worry about Ben and Jordan Peterson one little bit. And so when you spit Christ the King at them to insist that they have been rejected by the one who sent them to do the work that they're doing, no. Now, that just doesn't sit with me in the least. My friend, Ben.
So, a couple things there is, first of all, I agree with him. I don't think that God's going to abandon them if they're doing what God wants them to do. The problem is that Christ himself says what it takes to follow him. And he doesn't mince words about these things. And so one of the things he says is in Matthew chapter 10, he says, so have no fear of them, for nothing is covered that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. What I tell you in the dark, say in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim on the housetops. And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore. You are of more value than many sparrows. So everyone who acknowledges me before men, I also will acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven. Now, I think this is ultimately, this passage, the first little bit there, is what Andrew Klavan is referencing when he says, God's not going to send his boys into battle and then abandon them. And, this is true. For example, I was a Protestant before I became Catholic, and it's clear that God was obviously guiding me the whole way. It was Protestants that exposed me to the thought of Thomas Aquinas, and it was ultimately categories of Thomas Aquinas that helped me understand the Catholic faith as it was actually presented. And I know plenty of people who didn't, convert, who studied the same stuff I did. But the bottom line is that God was still with me in those Protestant churches as I continued to work with the knowledge that I currently had. And so in that sense, I think Klavan is right. But at the same time, Jordan Peterson's wife just had a miraculous miracle that he himself struggles to explain if anybody's watched the video. And we covered it last week, so take a look. But that means that there does come a decision point. He's right, it's not a game show, and even the Catholic Church talks about the fact that those in the catechism, that about those who have never heard. And I think it's a great example of how complicated this issue can be. And I think they have the best answer on it. Because on the one hand, they're trying to uphold God's justice, but on the other hand, they're trying to uphold the accountability for those who do know Jesus and choose not to follow him. And so when Klavan says, it would be destructive to Ben's family life if he converted, well, Jesus knew this too. In fact, the church wouldn't be what it was if the early Christians who were Jewish held their families in higher regard than Jesus. And Jesus says this in this passage, Matthew 10:26 through 39. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those of his own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And the thing that we overlook in this passage oftentimes is this, is that to be a Christian back then, your family reputation was a kind of welfare or a safety net. If your family couldn't vouch for you, you were in trouble. And so if you go and decide to follow the guy who's claiming to be God, and even after Christ, there are plenty of examples of martyrs who, and I can't remember who it was, I think it was Perpetua, whose family abandoned her when she would not burn the incense. And if I've got that wrong, feel free, Catholics, to correct me on that, but I'm pretty sure it was Perpetua. And so it's if you're going to cite the Bible against racism and say, well, it's in the book, this is what it is. Well, and you don't have the right to make Christ, this is essentially Klavan's argument. You can't spout off Christ the King as some sort of, polemic against my friends who don't see Christ as the King, just so that you can say what you want to say. In other words, you can't make Christ in your own image. But the problem is, and anybody who's listened to Andrew Klavan for a while knows that there are plenty of things that he doesn't see in the Bible as holding the level of sin that we would say it should, like homosexuality or things like that. He doesn't think that marriage should be defined that way, from what I've seen. But at the end of the day, sexual immorality is a real problem for God's judgment. It just is, just as much as racism is in some cases. And so you can't say, well, God hates racism, but he's okay with this, with homosexuality over here. It's just not a consistent position, which gets to the question of, okay, well, what are we actually dealing with here then? Whose Christ are we actually following? And earlier last week, Ted Cruz came out and supported IVF. He's a Southern Baptist guy. And then Russell Brand comes out and he says, which denomination should I be baptized in? And then Tom Holland, who's a historian, I plan to watch that this weekend and cover it on Monday. But he has a conversation where he talks about the fact that he prayed to Mary and had what appears to be a miraculous healing. So who are we supposed to listen to? And if we can't agree, what are the consequences going to be? And I think Hannah Arendt has a good answer for this. Hannah Arendt is talking about the common world in this quote. And what she means by the common world is not common sense. What she means, well, maybe you could think of it that way, but what she explicitly says earlier on in this chapter is that the common world is actually the thing by which we relate to one another. The kind of think of like, the background that you see right here on my screen. You've got these kind of wire frames and these little nodes. The common world is the infrastructure that allows those nodes to connect. And so this common world is and I guess for those listening on the podcast, you're not going to see it. So just imagine a spider web with like dots. And the web is the stuff that makes the web possible, or the nodes possible. And that's how we relate to one another. And so what she's going to say here is that under conditions of a common world, in other words, a common fabric, reality is not guaranteed primarily by the common nature of all men who constitute it. Meaning, it's not enough for us to just have the Imago Dei and therefore we're all going to just arrive at the truth by virtue of that thing. We all have the potential to perceive that, but we're not going to necessarily have it just by virtue of us having a common nature. Any more than the common nature of a dog makes all dogs dig bones and bury them in the yard. If you've ever had a dog that doesn't do that, I've always thought that was kind of weird. I did have dogs that didn't do that. But anyway, so the common nature of all men who constitute it, but rather by the fact that differences of position and the resulting variety of perspectives notwithstanding, everybody is always concerned with the same object. If the sameness of the object, and this is the important part, think Christ is king as the object in this discussion. If the sameness of the object can no longer be discerned, no common nature of men, least of all the unnatural conformism of a mass society, can prevent the destruction of the common world, meaning that fabric that holds us all together, which is usually preceded by the destruction of the many aspects in which it presents itself to human plurality. She goes on to say, this can happen under conditions of radical isolation, where nobody can any longer agree with anybody else, as is usually the case in tyrannies. And we'll come back to that quote in a second, but I want to just highlight this. Social media, everybody knows, is isolating. And, even now, I'm like covering a story and I don't even have to leave my house to go talk to Andrew Klavan and get the scoop. It's just out there on the internet. I can consume it. I can commentate on it and I can put it out there for the world to see. And then you're going to consume this and you're going to move on to the next thing. And the same thing's going to happen with the video games you play. In fact, you're even going to do this with the books that you read. You're just constantly able to consume. And as a result, nothing lasts because nothing can stay. You don't read a book 15, 12, 30 times because your library is small. Now, that doesn't mean that I think we should go back to that. But what she's trying to say is that when we can no longer agree on our aim or on the nature of the object that does highlight our common nature, then tyrannies are going to start to foster. And that's exactly what's happening. Because if we do not, as Christians, have a shared identity and morality, then why would Ted Cruz feel any sort of obligation to actually represent us in the Senate and not promote IVF? And because all it is for those senators is just a cost-benefit analysis on what's going to keep them elected. That's their job. Their job is to represent the public. But if we can't unite publicly over what it means to be a Christian, in other words, Andrew Klavan says that homosexuality and that the church kind of needs to be a little bit softer on this issue and it's ultimately not that big of a deal. And over here, Candace is saying, I think that there's all this crazy stuff going on in Israel and kind of, I'm not saying it's this, but it could be that, Well, then now Christianity becomes an uncertain bet for politicians, and we will no longer get any representation. If we can't agree, nobody's going to represent us. And so if half of the Christians are 25% of the Christians are saying IVF is okay, 30% are saying there's no way it's okay, 20% say it doesn't matter, and the other ones are over here screaming at Israel, well, no one's going to want to take that bet, especially considering that the left is almost entirely united on all of their sacred cows. There's an article on my Substack you can go and look at where I broke down the issue when you look at how conservatives define family and how the liberals define abortion and these other issues. We are almost completely split 50-50 amongst really conservative and moderately conservative on almost every moral issue we have, whereas what the left thinks is morally important is almost entirely united, like 90% across moderate liberals and far left liberals. And so the issue that I have with, or not issue, but the reason why I think that the Daily Wire thing is more important than the fact that Candace left or it's a free speech issue or any of these things is that it's highlighting something in Christianity that if we cannot understand what it means for Christ to be king, and that means that there's some moral laws that come with that, and that we don't get to pick and choose. We don't get to pick and choose the morality that we're going to ascribe to, especially if we're going to quote scripture at somebody else for violating morality that scripture says explicitly is wrong. There's neither Jew nor Greek. Absolutely, because we're all made in the image of God, and the new covenant is open to everybody. But at the same time, Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed for a reason, for its sexual immorality, and Jude says that explicitly. So we have to recognize that the Daily Wire issue and the fact that Daily Wire is a really powerful brand and also associates most of its ideas with Christianity, that the more fractured the Christianity becomes, the less capable it will be for politicians and leaders to represent it. So the question becomes, okay, well, yeah, but if we can't agree on the same object, then what is going to actually cause us to agree? What is going to actually be enough for us to come together and say, okay, this is what it means to follow Christ? And I think what that's going to take is, number one, it's going to take progress because we're all in a different spot. That part, Andrew Klavan's absolutely right. Jordan Peterson's in a different spot. Andrew Klavan's in a different spot. I'm in a different spot. You're in a different spot. And this is what Hannah Arendt is saying, is that it's not enough for us to have common nature because ultimately we have different experiences, which is why the object has to be definable so that we can interpret our experiences through that object. But once we start to say, no, you don't have the object over there. No, I have the object. And there's no authority behind us to support that, either miraculous ones or a church or an institution like the Catholic Church. Well, if everybody has their own little Jesus out there, and those definitions are mutually exclusive, then ultimately we're going to have to be faithful to the truth that we do know, number one. And number two, we're going to have to be willing to follow God wherever he leads. And I believe that if you continue to follow him, it will end up in the Catholic Church. Because if you look at the miracles, for example, that happened with Tammy Peterson and the Rosary, what church is she supposed to go to? She's going to walk into an SBC church after she's been miraculously healed praying a novena. How's she going to share her testimony in a small group? The reality is, and some people will say, well, yeah, but the Baptist guys have miracles too. So is that fair? Well, the problem is that there's no doctrinal positions that could be verified by a miracle. So in the sense that it could verify the authority of the Bible, but the Catholics have the Bible too. And so I think that God can definitely use Protestants to get you to where he wants you to go. But like Andrew Klavan said, God's not going to abandon you because of the fact that you're in a state of ignorance right now and you're not sure. But at the same time, if God moves in your life in a way that is highly personal, highly subjective, and also confirming of a doctrine that the Catholic Church has, and you do not decide to go there, then I think, like Bishop Barron says, if you're not in the army of Christ, you're in the army of the devil. And Bishop Barron said that on Jordan Peterson's podcast last week. So at the end of the day, we still have to follow Christ based on what we know. And we still have to understand that we can't pick and choose what we want out of the Bible any more than we can, say Christ the King when we feel like it's going to get us clicks. We have to be willing to engage the truth rather than present information for the reaction it gets out of people or the reaction it gets out of us. We have to be willing to do the mundane, to read the books, to understand that eventually the war in Israel is going to stop. Eventually the war in Russia and Ukraine is going to stop, and there's going to be something else. There's going to be some other controversy to chase down. So the question that we all need to be asking ourselves is, what are those eternal truths, moral and theological, that we must agree on in our lives to follow Christ as king? And if he's a king, he's got to have a kingdom. One kingdom. Not a whole bunch of kingdoms, but one kingdom. And I think God's going to judge us all based on what he gave us and what we did with that. And at the end of the day, he's not going to be unmerciful to those who maybe didn't get to where They could have gotten it because of some evil thing that happened to them. Ultimately, God is the one who judges who's getting in and who's not. So at the end of the day, we just got to keep thinking, and we got to keep pushing forward and trusting God and asking Him to lead us to where we're going to be. Because the one thing that seems to happen whenever there's uncertainty about what the truth actually is, a miracle clears that up pretty quickly. And it really shows not that we don't understand, but that we don't want to submit. So, anyway, that's all I have tonight, and that was a quick kind of rundown. It went a little longer than I thought, but I really enjoyed talking to you all, and if you liked this video, make sure you subscribe and follow me on Twitter, @MysticDan, and I'll see you next time. Keep thinking. If I have an outro. It's dead. I don't have my outro, so I'm just gonna have to end. This is what happens when you're on your own. Anyway, have a good night, everybody.